Hi, you guys. It's Professor Tracy Daniel here, and I'm back for chapter 16. So, a little bit of housekeeping before I get started with the chapter. Um, Remember, I have dogs, so if you hear barking, remember it's just my pups, Ears and Maggie. So sometimes they like to let themselves be known in the videos. But okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So this chapter is chapter 16 in your Give Me Liberty textbook, and it's titled America's Gilded Age. So one thing you'll notice is that in these chapters, the way that it's put together, there's a bit of overlap because last chapter, when we were talking about Reconstruction ends in 1877, but this chapter starts in 1870. So there is a bit of overlap as we will be, as we weave together this story here. So we are still technically in the period of Reconstruction, but we won't really be talking about Reconstruction. We'll be talking about this period in American history that's known as the Gilded Age. So, your textbook gives this chapter a scope of between 1870 and 1890. So, we'll be talking about 20 years, give or take, of some time here. We'll go a little bit outside of the scope, but let's get started. So I really like teaching about the Gilded Age. I really love, especially now, talking about this period of the Gilded Age. So first we'll discuss why is it called the Gilded Age? So gilded refers to something that is glittering on the outside or something that is covered with a nice metal or fine metal on the outside, but the inside is rotten or the inside reveals something of very little value. So, this period is known as the Gilded Age because if you're looking at America from the outside, America looks very rich and you have a lot of wealth. But unfortunately, this wealth is concentrated among the few. And so while it looks great on the outside, once you really get into the inside, you see that there's corruption in politics. You see that while there is wealth, it is not equally distributed, and that a small population, or a small, dare I say, percentage of the population owns the vast majority of the wealth. So there's a lot of, I would say, rotten things in the center. So that's why it's called the Gilded Age. On the outside, it looks great, but on the inside, it is still rotten and there's still something of very little value. There's also some significance to this period, right? So we have a lot of technological innovations that are really happening during this period. We have the railroad, which will get thousands of miles of railroad laid during this time. We get barons of industry, these names that we kind of throw around now, but this is where they get their beginnings. The Andrew Carnegies, the John D. Rockefellers, the J.P. Morgans, and the Cornelius Vanderbilts all really get their fortunes and make a name for themselves during this period as being barons of industry. During this period, there is also increased wealth. You have people who are incredibly wealthy during this time. But with the increased wealth, as I said before, the wealth is concentrated among a very small population. And so, with that increased wealth, we also get increased poverty. And so, we'll really be studying that. It's also at this time that we get the closing of the Western frontier and the tragedy, the absolute tragedy of the indigenous populations of the Great Plains. And we'll speak a bit about Wounded Knee as well in this chapter. So if you're following along with your PowerPoint that's on D2L, you'll notice that in the second slide, I put this political cartoon. And you see someone, and if I'm trying to read this, I'll have to zoom in myself a little bit. You have someone a man who is dressed in a suit and it says Pullman, and you see a man who is being really squeezed in a vice. He is being squeezed by low wages on the top and high rent at the bottom. So I want you to think of yourself, what does this say about the man that's being squeezed? He is being squeezed by low wages because at this time, we're talking about a period in American history where there really is no social safety net. There is no such thing as minimum wage. There is no such thing as workers' comp. There is no such thing as child labor laws. None of these things exist. And so you have the workers who are being who don't have a minimum wage, who are working for many times 6 days a week for 12 to 16 hours a day for very low wages, yet rents are remaining really high. So it says a lot. This political cartoon says quite a bit about, I would say, the conditions of the working class. So we'll really be talking a lot about the working class. So, with the Gilded Age, as I was saying before, we get a lot of these family dynasties, the creation of family dynasties. We have a lot of wealth. And one of the people who has, or I would say some of the few people who have a lot of this wealth would be, one example would be Andrew Carnegie with Carnegie Steel. And because of the railroads, he's making a lot of money. You need steel for these railroads. We also have John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, which will be a monopoly. We'll talk a bit more about him. We also have Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a railroad baron, as well as J.P. Morgan, who came from wealth. He came from a family of wealth. And as I've heard it described, wealth in two ways. He came from a pretty wealthy family whose business was money. He was a famous financier. His father really taught him as his surviving son. He really taught him the financial business. So J.P. Morgan was a banker on Wall Street, a banker and financier who really dealt with a lot of foreign investments, but he was wealthy in, I would say, in a couple of different ways. He was a man who came from wealth, whose literal business was wealth and money. Right. And so during this time, a lot of I would say society is really divided between your haves, which is really a small percentage of society, and your have nots. By 1890, 1%, the top 1% of society received the same total income as the bottom half of the population and owned more property than the remaining 99% of the population. I'll repeat that just so you realize how huge that is, right? So by 1890, the top 1% received the same total income as the bottom half of the population, and they owned more property than the remaining 99% of society, right? So with all of this vast wealth, you start to see people begin to buy things, not necessarily because they need it, but really just to show that they have wealth. Thorstein Veblen coined the phrase in his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. And by leisure class, it's, your upper class, right? Your upper echelon of society. Thorstein Veblen coins the phrase conspicuous consumption, okay? Conspicuous consumption. In his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, he offers a pretty critical critique of the upper class and says that they are spending money just to demonstrate that they have wealth. Okay, that is conspicuous consumption. It is spending money just to demonstrate that you have wealth. An example, I would say, of conspicuous consumption, because one thing I typically ask my classes when we're in person is conspicuous consumption an issue in our society? And I'll say yes. conspicuous consumption is an issue in our society because we could just buy a car. You could buy, a celebrity could buy a Hyundai or a Honda or a Toyota or a Kia. But instead, no, they're not gonna get that. They're gonna get a Maybach. They're gonna get a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or um yeah, a Bugatti, which I'm gonna assume is a car because I just don't know a lot about it. But they buy these vehicles really just to show that they have the money to buy it, right? Or I'm going to not just buy a purse, I'm going to buy a Chanel bag. Or what was Sweetie talking about? What were those bags that Sweetie was talking? Birkin bags, which to me, hey, don't come at me, don't come for me, but Birkin bags are not great looking bags to me. But people will purchase these bags just to show that they have money. That is conspicuous consumption. And it's another reason why I love teaching about the Gilded Age because there are so many parallels in the society that we have now, especially this pandemic society that we're currently living in here in 2021. Um, During the pandemic, we had a lot of people who lost money. We have a lot of people who are in poverty right now. However, the top 1% made a lot of money, honestly, during the pandemic. And so there are some parallels between the Gilded Age and 21st century society that we're living in now. Even some current historians have posited that we are living in a second Gilded Age because while America is very wealthy, that wealth is concentrated among the few and it's not equally distributed among the people. So that's something that I want you guys to think about. Do you see conspicuous consumption in our society? Do you think that we are living in a second Gilded Age? Shoot me an email, ask me some questions. I'm totally here for it. I love these discussions. So, really, shoot me an email to my email that I'm not going to say on here, but you guys who are in my class have my email. Shoot me an email and answer the question after this lecture of do you think we're in a second Gilded Age based on what you learn in this lecture? Okay, but I digress. Thorstein Veblen again coined the term conspicuous consumption, which is defined as spending money just to demonstrate the possession of wealth. Okay. Um, so we continue to the second industrial revolution. It's during this time that we're also in this second industrial revolution, and it's really railroads that make the second industrial revolution possible. Again, it is railroads that make the second industrial revolution possible. Between 1860 and 1880, the number of miles of railroad in the United States will triple, and it will triple again by 1920. So remember, we have some barons of industry. We have Cornelius Vanderbilt, who is in the railroad business, and then we have Andrew Carnegie, who is in the steel business. And remember, we need steel for the locomotives, we need steel for the actual rails. So remember all of this as we continue during this lecture. So it's during this time that we see a huge expansion in factory production. We see a huge expansion as well in mining because these railroads will need, or these locomotives will run on coal. They'll be coal powered. And so we'll see a huge expansion in factory production, in mining, as well as in railroad construction. Another thing about the Gilded Age is that it is a time of rapid industrialization. The United States is industrializing, and if I lived during this time, it would seem like it was all happening overnight. So we're at a time of rapid industrialization. And with rapid industrialization, you'll get labor conflicts, you'll get tension between the social classes, but I digress again. Because of the railroad, remember, between 1860 and 1880, the miles of railroad in the United States will triple, and it will triple again by 1920. Because of this, people don't have to think locally anymore. You can start to think nationally. So if you have a brand, you're not just thinking about selling your brand of jam or your brand of soap. It's no longer something that you sell in just your local store. You can put that on a train and you can sell it across the country. So, because of the railroad, it will also lead to the transmission, well, I would say the creation and the transmission of local brands or national brands, rather. It will lead to the transmission and creation of national branding and national brands. So, it's during this Gilded Age that we are transitioning to a more industrial society. And with this industrial society again comes labor conflicts. You get tensions between the classes because at this time, remember, while we have workers and we have this great, or I would say vast amount of wealth, workers don't have freedom and they really don't have a voice during this time. This is a time that if you are in the working class, it's a time of economic instability. It's a time of economic insecurity as well as poverty. The factories at this time are plagued by dangerous working conditions. It's a huge concern at this time. And this is a time, again, where America doesn't have a social safety net. So if you get hurt at work, there are some cases where they may take care of you, but in more cases than not, someone else just takes your job. There is no workers' comp. There is nothing to protect you. It's so dangerous at this time that between 1880 and 1900, an average of 35,000 workers died every year in workplace accidents. Think about that. 35,000 workers will die in workplace accidents every year in a 20-year period between 1880 and 1900. And remember, at this time, I've said that there's no workers' comp and there's dangerous working conditions, but this is also a time where there are no child labor laws. So, again, if you are looking on your slide, you'll notice that in slide 5, I have a picture of a young girl, and she appears to be like in a textile mill, right? But it's this young girl who can't be more than, maybe 6 years old. There are no child labor laws. It's also a time where, because there is economic insecurity and economic instability and such a vast amount of poverty, it's absolutely necessary for every person in the family to work in order for the family to survive. So it's not unusual for children to work in mills and to work in factories because it was necessary for the survival of the family. Okay, so that's 18 minutes so far. I will check back with you in part 2, where we'll continue with Andrew Carnegie. All right, see you in a bit.